On behalf of Beacon House School System, I'd like to welcome you to the session of the 13th edition of SOT, A World of Tomorrow 2021 and beyond, Towards Happier Future. The School of Tomorrow event series was launched by Beacon House in the year 2000 to engage in conversations with local and global audiences and help inform the direction of the organization, the schools, and the society at large. My name is Mehmet Sarfaraz. I'm a journalist, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the third fully virtual SOT event. Thank you for joining me on this panel, Mr. James M. Dorsey, Fahad Hussain, Dr. Taimur Rahman, and Edward Davis. Let me introduce you to the esteemed panelists. Mr. James M. Dorsey is a senior fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute, co-director of the Institute of Fan Culture at the University of Würzburg in Germany. I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, and author of 4 books, including The Turbulent World of Middle East, China and the Middle East, Venturing into the Maelstrom, and Comparative Political Transitions between Southeast Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. And Dr. Taimur Rahman is an academic, musician, and political activist. He's Associate Professor of Politics at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS as we call it. He's also the spokesperson for the rock band Lal, that is known for its progressive and leftist views. His published work includes The Class Structure of Pakistan, which won the Akhtar Hamid Khan Memorial Award for the same year. His Urdu lectures are available on YouTube on philosophy, political science, and showcase how social media can be utilized for modern education. Mr. Fahad Hussain is a well-known journalist and has worked for a number of media organizations since 1991. He brings with him a wealth of experience, having spent 30 years in print and broadcast journalism, both in Pakistan and abroad. During this time, he has been a newspaper reporter, editor, columnist, TV anchor, and news director. He has also spearheaded the launch of 3 news channels. At present, Fahad Hussain Saab is the resident editor Islamabad for Dawn newspaper. He also writes a twice weekly column for Dawn. He's also a TV anchor and hosts a weekend primetime show for Dawn News TV. Mr. Edward Davis, who's a development practitioner and professional, has also taught on programs at the London School of Economics and UCL Institute of Education. After working in UK education and local government, Mr. Edward has worked in development in Abu Dhabi, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and several other countries for NGOs, and since 2012 with DFID FCDO. He was seconded into the Global Partnership for Education at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. before joining the British Embassy, Kabul, and now the UK Afghanistan Task Force, leading team on economic stability, basic services, and governance. Thank you all for joining me on this panel. And let's introduce the topic. Topic today is A House Divided, Skewed Perceptions on Afghanistan. Only a few months after the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, the global conversation continues to focus on the symptoms of the fall of Kabul rather than the problems. The Western world and the US are principally worried about the possibility of the war-torn country becoming a hub of terrorism. China wants a stable and peaceful Afghanistan as a necessary channel to extend its connectivity and development projects to the Central Asian states. And for Iran and India, the Taliban coming to power as undisputed rulers of Afghanistan means a marked reduction in their influence on the region. What the global community fails to understand is what will be the future of Afghanistan and its people under the Taliban regime. So this is what we are going to discuss. We have a very esteemed panel with us. And I'd like to begin by asking my panelists the first question, which is, what will be the future of Afghanistan and its people under the Taliban regime? I'd like to start with Mr. Dorsey, please. Sir. You're muted, sir. If you could unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I think the jury is out. Obviously, if one looks at the history of the Taliban, as well as the record of the last 3 months, it would be very hard to be optimistic about where things are going. Having said that, and I'm not saying that there is reason for optimism, but there are a lot of what Donald Rumsfeld would have called unknown unknowns. So for one, we don't know what the balance of power ultimately will be within the Taliban itself, and within different factions. We don't know to what degree the Taliban is going to get a grip on its rank and file across the country. We don't know how the conflict with the Islamic State is going to play out. And we don't know to what degree the Taliban are going to be capable of maintaining control of militant groups operating on Afghan soil. I think that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that from the international community's perspective, clearly security is going to be a major concern. And so that, again, goes to the point of whether or not they can control foreign groups operating on Afghan soil, to what degree they will and can cooperate with external forces, including the United States, in terms of fighting the Islamic State, and to what degree they will comply, and those demands will certainly come, to hand over, certainly to the Chinese foreign fighters, and those, in the case of the Chinese, those of Uyghur origin. So I think there are a whole bunch of these questions that we just simply don't know. But I would say on balance, it doesn't look good.
Yes, I agree with you. And can I go to Mr. Edward Davis to answer the same question, please?
Thanks, Mehmal. I'll build on what James has said, but I agree with everything that he's mentioned. I think it's always important to realize that the future wasn't that bright before the Taliban takeover of Kabul. Afghanistan was one of the poorest, most fragile countries in the world. It was undergoing the second severe drought in 3 years, particularly in the western areas. So there were already a very complex and challenging set of issues the country was facing. Despite those, it had made significant progress. The last 20 years, particularly for women and for girls, the progress has been fairly dramatic, albeit from a very low level and with a long way to go. So I think, as James said, the future is unclear, but the present is extremely concerning. Food insecurity, it was already a major issue before the Taliban takeover, with 18 million people in the World Bank's second highest food insecurity measure. Now 24 million people are falling into that highest level of acute food insecurity. So that's a real worry. And that's fueled not just by the takeover, but by the economic crisis. 75% of Afghanistan's public expenditure had come from overseas. And that has been completely paused apart from humanitarian support. We've seen the internal displacement of people, nearly 750,000, although we haven't seen that spilling over into the region, perhaps as it has in previous decades. So there are a number of reasons, I think, to share some of the pessimism that James alluded to. Equally, we're not seeing the continuation of the progress that I referred to earlier. We know that the Taliban have not reopened secondary schools for girls, even if they have done for boys. We know there are no women in the interim government, and we know that there is no parliament, whereas previously there was a quota. I think it was 28 or 38% of parliament had to be female. So a lot of those gains look jeopardized. The final thing I would say is what is interesting about the way that the Taliban have achieved power. They do seem to have wanted to take over some of the state institutions. They do want to maintain some of the service delivery mechanisms that existed before. And as they took over different provinces, they were keen to ask NGOs, others, to maintain what they were doing. So there may be some cautious optimism for what the Taliban want to achieve, but still many unanswered questions, particularly around the way that minorities, women, and girls will be treated. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, because you've highlighted how the vulnerable, especially the minorities, women, and they're being treated there. So Taimur, I'd come to you right now, and if you could weigh in.
Sure, Mehmal, I would say that this is an unmitigated disaster. 4 US presidents have come and gone, and Afghanistan has been under US occupation for 20 years. $2 trillion have been spent on that occupation. 2,300 soldiers' lives were lost. These are just American soldiers I'm talking about. And the number of people, who died in that conflict on the other side, I'm not even sure what the statistic there is. but it's in tens of thousands. And what do we have to show for it? What do we have at the end of this 20-year period? We have the Taliban back in power. Not only are they back in power, but they are even more in control of Afghanistan than they were in the past. In the past, they didn't control the north, they didn't control Mazar-e-Sharif, etc., but they do now. So, if we look at the various criteria that the world community and we ourselves accept, democratic development is definitely gone backwards. There's no parliament, there's no rule of law at the moment. The development of a secular society has gone backwards. I feel that this is very important for the Muslim world as a whole, because we've been through horrific sectarian conflicts, and without secularism, I don't think we can get out of that sectarian conflict. In terms of economic development, you've already heard, and you yourself know that Afghanistan requires food assistance in order to feed its population. So there is no significant economic development. It's facing international isolation, and it's going to face a massive food shortage. As far as women are concerned, high schools have been closed for girls. Women are forced out of the workforce. And soon you will see the implementation of various Sharia laws, because they're very committed to those laws. So women's rights are going backwards. As far as minority rights are concerned, we know that the Taliban tend to be Deobandi or Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat, and they will fall into an inevitable conflict with the Shiite of the north. And last but certainly not least, the victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan has fueled the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which was till now, after the military operations in Pakistan based in Afghanistan. It has rearmed them, refueled them, and TTP has been carrying out various terrorist attacks and various attacks of other sorts against Pakistani state institutions since the TTA has come to power. So for Afghanistan as well as for Pakistan, in my view, this represents...
We've lost Taimur. Taimur, I think, yes, you froze a bit.
Okay.
And please complete.
Okay. So I was just going to say that given the way in which TTP is re-emerging, we are going to see much greater examples of extremism in Pakistan as well as in Afghanistan. So I think it's a huge disaster. Thank you.
Thank you. As soon as Fahad Saab joins, I'll ask him the same question again. But Mr. Dorsey, I'd like to come to you. You said, the jury is out about the future of Afghanistan, and there are obviously factions within the Taliban regime as well. So if you could put some light on that, what's going on between the factions and how it's impacting the governance, because as Mr. Edward Davis and Taimur Rahman also pointed out that, there are a lot of humanitarian problems, crises that we've been hearing about. So how will this factionalism between the Taliban would it hamper the development, the governance, and the humanitarian crisis? What's the future about that? If you could just briefly talk about that. Thank you.
I think, first of all, I think that you've clearly seen differences between those parts of the Taliban that have had some degree of international exposure, the ones who were at the Doha negotiations, versus very many of the Taliban, the vast majority of the Taliban, who've never traveled abroad. At the best, they may have traveled to parts of Pakistan, but that's what would have been the furthest that they went. So I think there's that issue. I think there's an issue of basically the urban versus rural. There's also the issue of the military wing versus call it the civilian wing if you wish. But in any case, the more militant, more hardline military parts of the Taliban, like the Haqqani network. And it's not clear how that will work out. I think one thing to keep in mind, which is important, is that the Taliban belong to a category of militant groups that have their origins in service provision. And therefore, what Mr. Davis was pointing out, the fact that there is a desire to take over some of the service functions of the state That's actually, in a sense, built into the DNA of the Taliban, and that is, if you wish, a hopeful sign to hang on to. Now, the question with that is whether or not, and there's no evidence that that's the way it works, whether engagement with that service provision aspect of the Taliban, particularly in a situation where you have a huge humanitarian crisis, is ultimately going to lead to the Taliban being open to adopt other demands or policies that the international community would like to see, for example, with regard to women. Now, I'm not advocating with that the opposite, namely withholding that kind of aid would do the trick. I don't think it would do the trick, and I don't think that's what one should do, because then one's fighting these battles over the backs of innocent people. What I'm saying is, I think one has to manage one's expectations, even though humanitarian aid may be the right thing to do. So, in sum, I think it's, and again, the other element in this is what I had mentioned before. If you get an escalation of the conflict between the Islamic State and the Taliban, that again could have an impact on the balance of power within the Taliban. And let me just throw in one other aspect, and Timur referred to that, and I think Eric did too, with regard to minorities. Again, you've already seen contradictions. You've seen that on women's issues also, but you've already seen contradictions in terms of how Taliban in different parts of the country deal with the Hazara Shiites. So you've had the gestures, for example, during Ashura in Kabul and elsewhere, where there was a reaching out to the Shia community, there was a protection of the community as they performed their religious rituals. And yet in other parts of the country, you're seeing Hazara Shiites being forced out of their villages, their properties confiscated with nowhere to go. And that, of course, raises the question over time how Iran is going to respond to that. And again, that would have an impact. So coming back to Donald Rumsfeld, we have a lot of unknowns.
Okay, and Mr. Fahad Hussain has joined us. So Fahad Saab, I'd like to ask you the first question that everybody has already answered, which is that, what will be the future of Afghanistan and its people under the Taliban regime? Fahad Saab, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry, you're muted.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I think it's a key question, and I think it depends a lot in terms of how the Taliban government is able to somehow reintegrate itself into the global mainstream. We've already seen the statement coming out of the United Nations about the looming humanitarian disaster that the Afghan people of Afghanistan may face in the next couple of months during the winters. And this is despite the fact that many of the countries are acknowledging the threat of this disaster and promising aid, as well as sending whatever else other help they can send. But I think the larger question is whether the Taliban are able to move towards a recognition. And that, of course, depends on the kind of policies that they undertake. Now, obviously, there's a difference between how the recognition issue was approached last time around that the Taliban were in power and how it is being dealt at this time. And of course, if you look at how Pakistan is approaching it, Pakistan was one of the three countries which had taken the lead in recognizing Taliban. But this time around, in my opinion, rightly so, they are not pushing for it as aggressively as they had last time around. So it's been a couple of months, and there is no real headway in terms of the Taliban taking any major steps that are required for that recognition. If international recognition does not come, for another, couple of months or even longer. And if the next 2, 3, 4 months are very harsh, then I think we're looking at a very different kind of a challenge for this government. Obviously, the first main priority for any government, any new government, is to establish themselves to somehow ensure that their foundations are strong enough for them to sustain the challenge or the burden of governance. I think the Taliban are, for various reasons, many of which actually pertain to themselves, are refusing to acknowledge the gravity of the challenge that they face. And because of that, because of this refusal or adamancy or some other reason, I think the next couple of months could prove decisive. We've already, I believe, talked about the threat from the IS. And if the law and order situation continues to worsen, and it is supplemented by a humanitarian disaster, then I don't know what options Taliban would have other than relenting on issues that they seem to be very inflexible on. So I think, generally speaking, the outlook does not look very promising, and from Pakistan's point of view, I think it is even more grim, because if things begin to go south there, then I think we are going to have to face the fallout of that situation, both in terms of a greater influx of refugees, as well as the instability and violence that may come our way as a result of intensified fighting between the IS and the Taliban.
Has talked about winter, and Edward Davis, I would like to actually come to you, because Senator Sherry Rahman has just recently written a piece called "Winter is Coming," and Fahad has talked about how the next few months are going to be crucial and also very harsh. Senator Sherry Rahman writes that the crisis is real. Pictures of Afghan children starving to death on the streets of Kabul are not fake. 8.7 million people are already at the emergency level. Financial contributions, food and medical assistance must reach these Afghans. So as Fahad mentioned that, because there's no international recognition yet, what could the international community do? I know that it has pledged a lot, and, they are saying that some humanitarian help will come and some is already there. But what's really going to happen on the ground, if you could tell us, please?
I'll do my best, Memal. Not being on the ground, I think all of us are finding, that we're talking from a distance. The humanitarian situation shouldn't be affected by the political situation. Humanitarian principles mean that humanitarian aid should be delivered based on humanitarian principles, and they should be free of political interference. The international community did pledge twice what the UN asked for back in I think it was the end of September, pledging 1.2 billion. However, the UN is now talking that the next appeal for the humanitarian response plan will be the largest in the UN's history. They're calculating a need of around $4 billion to cover the needs going into the winter for the next 3 to 6 months. So the catastrophe should not be underestimated. It's compounded by the points that have been made about legitimacy. That has created issues with the banking system in Afghanistan. So international correspondent banking has stopped. That means even for the humanitarian agencies, getting finance into the country has become a real challenge, because the banking system is frozen, dollars are not easily available, and this is hampering the humanitarian system. There's a role here to be played for by the international community and for Pakistan in making sure that those routes for foreign currency, for humanitarian assistance are maintained and kept open. Hopefully, we will see the delivery of aid. The airport is functioning, although we're not seeing as many flights as we would like. There are regional flights to the regional airports as well through the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service. But there's a real concern, I think, that the volume required may not be possible, and it's a difficult country to operate in. It's not similar from the former tribal regions in the north of Pakistan. It's difficult territory, and there will be communities that are left behind. If the humanitarian community get behind what they promised, I think we could avoid the worst. But on its own, humanitarian assistance is not enough to prevent the crisis, if you like. We need, as Fahd has mentioned, we need this question of legitimacy addressed. And if it isn't, the situation can only go downhill in the longer term.
Taimur, I'd like to come to you. I mean, we've heard other panelists, and we all talk about realpolitik after the Taliban rule in Afghanistan. People say that we have to be practical instead of being ideological. Sorry, Mr. Dorsey wants to actually add something. So you can go before Taimur, then I'll come to Taimur after that. Sorry, I just read your comment.
No, just very briefly. I think there's maybe an intermediate phase starting to develop. So what you're seeing is that the international community is recognizing, or at least parts of the international community, that they cannot operate and deploy huge sums of humanitarian aid without a presence on the ground. And so what you're now seeing, for example, that the European Union, which has a $1 billion aid package, is saying we're going to return people to the embassy or the EU mission in Kabul, which does not constitute recognition of the Taliban government, but this is the only way we can deploy that $1 billion. And on top of what they're saying is our mission can then serve as a basis for diplomats of EU member states who may wish to also return to Kabul. So I think that in some ways, in terms of the linkage between the deployment of humanitarian aid and diplomatic recognition of the Taliban, we're seeing an interim phase, which may be one hopeful sign, if you wish.
Thank you. So Taimur, I was asking you about, I mean, a lot of people talk about the moral and ideological side of it, but we're also hearing from people that, we have to be practical. So how do you think, I mean, it should be done? What do you have to say about that?
I think, Mehmal, the main question that we should be thinking about is that the state and the government that can be the most influential with respect to Afghanistan is, of course, Pakistan. And whatever the international community does or doesn't do, I think what matters more than what the international community does is what does Pakistan do and what does the state of Pakistan think. Now, sadly, both the establishment as well as the government of Pakistan have framed the victory of the Taliban as a victory against India or whatever, and that somehow we are led to believe that Islam and Pakistan has been victorious in Afghanistan. This is a highly unpragmatic point of view and an entirely ideologically incorrect point of view. There's no contradiction here between the two. It's just both sides are going in the opposite direction. Because not only, obviously, will the victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan destabilize Afghanistan, it's going to have disastrous consequences for Pakistan. Fahd has also, spoken about refugees, etc. And I earlier pointed out about the resurgent TTP. And even if it's not the resurgent TTP alone, there are going to be many, many organizations that are going to be able to utilize Afghanistan in order to destabilize Pakistan. That situation has not ended. That situation is very much a live, active grenade sitting in our hands that we have to manage. And so the actual question has to be to the Pakistani establishment and the Pakistani government: you're playing with fire. This is going to be yet another situation where a couple of years down the line you're going to be saying, we shouldn't have done this, we shouldn't have done that, we underestimated or overestimated this, and we should have been more aware, etc., etc. Because you're not really reading the situation right. Already Pakistan is suffering economically, and because of Pakistan has been acting, sad to say, as kind of like the foreign ministers of the Afghan Taliban. Afghan Taliban have an issue with Tajikistan, our prime minister feels the need to go and moderate that or fix that problem, etc. Whatever diplomatic or international issues the Afghan Taliban seem to face, it seems to be that that our government and our military establishment think that it is our duty to solve those problems, so to stabilize that particular government. And I think this is playing with fire. We are putting ourselves in the line of enormous trouble with respect to not just the international community, but with respect to destabilizing our own country. We've already seen the impact of religious extremism in Pakistan, the number of lives it's taken, the way in which it's devastated the economy and torn apart the social fabric of society. And I can't for the life of me understand why we think going down the same path again is going to have any different consequences or results. Thank you. Hello, thank you, Mehman. That was it from me, my side.
I think Memel's connection is probably gone.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Because I think our window is frozen.
Oh, that's what it probably is. Well, Fahd, maybe you'd like to continue and tell us something about the situation. You've been covering it in newspapers for a while.
Till the moderator comes back, we can have a self-generated discussion.
Absolutely.
But thank you, Taimur. If you allow me, I can just pick up from where you left off. I think there is a major concern in Islamabad. I'm covering
Sorry,
from here and speaking to a lot of people. Mehul, sorry, you had frozen, so we are just.
No, Fatah, yes, sorry, Fatah, please. Actually, I just wanted to ask you to add something to. I'm sorry, I had lost the connection for a while. So please continue. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So what I was saying was that when I'm speaking to officials here in Islamabad, I have myself personally detected a change of tone in the last couple of weeks. I think the original triumphant tone that we were hearing in the early days of the Taliban takeover, which was reflected in even the Prime Minister saying something like they've broken the shackles of slavery, etc., etc. And then even though the officials were kind of not playing it up too much, but you could see a certain element of glee on their faces or in their tones when they spoke. Over the last couple of weeks, that seems to have been tempered down a bit, and I can detect two main reasons for that. One is, of course, the situation in Afghanistan and the fact that the Taliban aren't really doing what we thought they would do. I think there was a bit of a misreading here. I think some people in Islamabad thought that once the Taliban are in government, they would follow a certain line of action which would help Pakistan justify a recognition for them. For example, their approach towards girls' education, etc., etc. That hasn't happened. And there is a grudging recognition here that the Taliban aren't really listening to Pakistan like we thought that they would. So that's problem number one, which is worsening with the intensity of violence that is happening from the IS side. So the situation on the ground is, I think, producing a kind of a picture which was not entirely visualized, I think, earlier on in Islamabad. And number two is the blowback from the United States. I think that's also hurting Pakistan. I'm not sure whether that was factored into our policy making, but I think this increasing tension with the US over Afghanistan and the fact that there is a genuine fear that we might be scapegoated, and we don't seem to have done anything to change that in the last couple of weeks. These two factors combined are making things a bit difficult for people, for decision makers in Islamabad. I'm not sure what options they are pursuing, but from what I gather, I think there is a renewed attempt to try and engage the US and try and convince them that Pakistan is one of the good guys. And secondly, a greater engagement with Afghanistan. Their foreign minister is expected in Islamabad. A greater push to have the Taliban take those actions which would help them gain recognition from these two countries. So I think if anybody in Islamabad thought that their biggest challenge was over when the Taliban came into power, I think they've realized that that challenge is just continuing to mutate into new ones.
Thank you, Fahad. Mr. Dorsey, I'd like to actually ask you a follow-up question to what Fahad has already said. What would be the political, social, economic outcomes of the current situation in Afghanistan on Pakistan, especially the political side? Because as Fahad has mentioned, that there's tension over Afghanistan with the US, so there's blowback from the US on Afghanistan. So how do you see that impacting Pakistan and the region?
I think there are two, with regard to Pakistan, I think there are two issues. One are the issues that the other speakers have rightfully noted, with other words, the influx of refugees, the emboldenment of ultra-conservatives, other militants, potentially more violence, and we've already seen that. I think that's all true. But I think there's another side of the equation, and that is a Pakistani government that plays into this, and we've seen that in the last instance in the deal that was cut with the TLP as they were threatening to march on Islamabad. Now, I'm not saying that there's if that deal were to lead to channeling them into a political process in which they play by the rules of the political process, that would not be a problem. But I think what you've seen in the kind of deal that was cut here was, again, a reinforcement of what you're already getting out of Afghanistan. And so I think, the problems that Pakistan potentially faces as a result, both of the way that it interacts with the Taliban, as the way with which it interacts with its domestic militants and ultra-conservatives, is a very slippery slope.
Okay, and Mr. Davis, if you could also talk about the impact on Pakistan.
Yeah, it's again, it's gazing into a crystal ball, isn't it? I mean, economically, Pakistan does a small amount of trade with Afghanistan. So the trade implications, the economic implications, are not going to be huge if we see this continued economic crisis. The other way around, however, is Pakistan is absolutely essential to Afghanistan, and keeping those trade routes open, the private sector trade routes open, is a critical part of preventing an absolute collapse in Afghanistan. We haven't seen the numbers, partly through a carefully managed policy from the Pakistani side of refugees crossing the border. So we don't have the issues that have happened in previous decades. Pakistan being one of the largest hosts to Afghan refugees. So we haven't seen that yet, but one can easily imagine a situation where large numbers of Afghans, because of the humanitarian situation, are trying to cross the border, and the international pressure that may bring. I mean, the other interesting dimension here, many of the issues that Pakistan faces play out in Afghanistan as well.
Sorry, I think
the government
lost you for a bit.
Sorry,
Can you hear?
I was just saying, can you hear me now, Mama?
Yes, we can. Continue, please.
Okay. I mean, one of the issues is the lack of inclusivity of the Taliban government. It's almost entirely Pashtun. Obviously, there's issues of Pashtun nationalism on the other side of the border as well. So it'd be interesting in the relevance of that. But I think that the biggest issues for Pakistan are yet to be seen, and that would be if there is genuine genuine vacuum and collapse in Afghanistan, which is still potentially possible, and a fragmentation of the Afghan state.
Thank you. Timur, I'd like to ask, there's this, I'm sure you've seen the news too, that the entire contingent of US female senators called on President Biden the political, economic, social, and women and girls. So do you think that, the international community can somehow do something about this, what's happening there with women and girls' education, and also, women not being allowed to work?
Well, naturally, they can continue to put pressure on the Afghan government and utilize international recognition and sometimes not humanitarian assistance, but other forms of aid and assistance and trade to ensure that Taliban follows through on these provisions. But as Fahad has already pointed out, even the ISI itself is growing more and more skeptical that they are ready to do that. I mean, they do understand that failure to comply with such ideas or such norms, etc., is going to result in international isolation. But I don't think they really, beyond stabilizing the economy to a very fundamental level, beyond that, I don't think they care too much about it, because they're quite committed to the idea that this is what Islam says and that this has to be implemented no matter what. So they're not pragmatists in that particular sense. I think one of the reasons why the ISI continues to grow and why the military establishment will continue to grow, more and more aware of the fact that the Taliban is not ready to play ball with them as they had earlier predicted, is the central matter of the TTP. I believe General Faiz went to Afghanistan in order to negotiate with the with the TTA, that the TTP should not be allowed to utilize Afghanistan as a basis to attack Pakistan, or as a base to attack Pakistan. And I think there he didn't receive the response that he expected. Earlier as well, Business Recorder reported that when the government of Pakistan approached the TTA to control the TTP, the TTA's response was, well, that's an independent organization. You talk to them directly. We have nothing to do with that. In other words, they basically said, no, we won't do anything. They are our friends and we won't touch them. You deal with them. You talk to them. These are signs that that the situation will not improve in the immediate future, because the TTA remains committed to its ideological principles, which are extremist and fundamentalist. And I think we have always been thinking that the TLP or the TTA or the TTP or Haqqani or others, etc., can be brought into the mainstream. We've been trying to mainstream them for the last decade, more than that now. And the only thing that has resulted in is that the mainstream has become more extremist rather than them becoming more moderate. You can look at public opinion polls. You can look at what's happened to Pakistan in the last 20 years, since the 1990s. And in the last 2 decades of mainstreaming extremists has resulted basically in the mainstream of Pakistan gravitating towards the religious right. So while the international community ought to, can do and must do what it has always done, apply pressure here and apply pressure there, though that pressure should not be applied to humanitarian assistance where people are starving, that comes first. I do not have any great expectations that the international community, in inverted commas, can play a major role. My expectations are, in fact, that regional powers have to play a more important role. That is China, Pakistan, Iran, and Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, together with Russia, need to play a very important role in ensuring that the Taliban are contained. And contained with respect to the spread of extremism, which is the number one most important priority for neighboring countries, obviously, but constrained also with respect to human rights abuses inside of their own countries. And that doesn't just mean, things such as flogging women and that sort of flogging people or amputating hands, etc., etc. It also means providing people with the opportunity for a decent, humane existence, allowing women to get education, allowing women to get work, allowing minorities equal rights, creating a parliament, creating the rule of law, creating a judicial system that actually is able to function and guarantee people their fundamental and basic rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Taimur. Fatsab, So can I ask you that, how can China and Pakistan together help Afghanistan get Afghanistan back on track, or China alone or Pakistan alone? I mean, because Temu talked about regional powers. So regional powers do have to play their role. How can they play their role in this? Muted, Fatah. We can't hear you. Sorry. Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
My apologies. My apologies. I think Taimur Saab is absolutely spot on. It is a regional issue. Of course, the US has a major stake in what happens in Afghanistan, but that interest is primarily, I think, focused on counter-terrorism efforts and to ensure that the Afghan soil cannot be used for terror attacks, in the region and especially on the US homeland. So there are, of course, negotiations going on between Pakistan and the US in terms of how Pakistan can help US in these CT efforts. But of course, that's a very focused and a very narrow view of Afghanistan that Washington is taking. However, regionally speaking, I think it's very clear. If you recall, I think it was possibly a couple of weeks back that there was a very important meeting of the heads of intelligence services of all the major regional countries that border Afghanistan. And that was held in Islamabad, and a lot of very important decisions were taken. So I think there is a clear recognition here that if Afghanistan has to be stabilized both financially as well as politically, then the key regional players have to take the lead. Now, this translates into very proactive actions by countries like China, Russia, Pakistan, of course, Iran, and then the Central Asian states. Now, the issue is that, immediately the key issue of how to ensure that the economy, the Afghan economy, can sustain itself. Now, China, of course, has interest in some investments. We've already heard about them talking to the new government in Afghanistan in terms of projects and other such areas where Chinese money can come in. Russia also has, I think, some interest there in terms of investment. But ultimately, it has to depend on the level of stability there, which means that in essence, even though the regional countries may want to pump in a lot of money, which I'm sure they will, because I think their interest is more in terms of Afghanistan not producing the kind of instability that can affect other countries. So therefore, their barometer or standard for recognition would be far lower than the one which is being peddled by, say, the US and other European countries. However, I don't think the stage has been reached where the regional countries would take a unilateral decision. I think there is a greater effort to somehow bring in the international community to take a collective decision. And I think in that sense, what the regional countries are doing are putting the kind of pressure that they can in order for Afghanistan, the Taliban, to move to a level where the regional countries can then try and bring in the recognition. So because till that happens, I think it will be the last resort for regional countries to go ahead and recognize the Taliban government then and start normalizing their relationship, both in terms of politics and economy and financial aid. So it's a difficult position for these countries, but absolutely, I think there is no doubt that the key stakeholders are these regional countries, and ultimately they are the ones who are going to play the leading role in trying to get Afghanistan to stand up on its own feet.
Mr. Dorsey, if you could answer the same question, what role can the regional players play in the stability of Afghanistan?
Let me pick up on several things that were said. I think, first of all, in terms of the international community, and even more importantly, the Muslim segment of the international community, the Taliban have proven to be oblivious. They've proven that in the late 1990s, when you had the negotiations over extradition of Osama bin Laden, and they've proven that in the last 3 months, where it was, the Qataris, the Turks, the Pakistanis, who were reaching out to the Taliban, for example, on the issue of women, on the issue of what may or may not be allowed, and what the different interpretations are of Islamic law. it's not something the Taliban have responded to, and there's no reason to believe that they will respond anytime soon. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing, and there I would I would differ with Fahad. I don't think that the economic attraction of Afghanistan is what people think it is. First of all, the Russians have far less interest, and you, in a sense, have a division of labor between the Russians and the Chinese. So you've had the Russian military maneuvers in Tajikistan and the CSTO maneuvers, which was really sort of saying or sending a message to the Taliban. The Chinese have been minimal. You know, they've talked a good talk, but they've been minimal in terms of what they've provided in humanitarian aid so far. Their investments, you know, their investment in mining, they put $341 million into this, and that's gotten them nothing. Those, when you look at rare earth, Afghanistan's rare earth is light rare earth. China has, particularly in Inner Mongolia, 37% of the world's reserves of light rare earth. And in fact, in terms of the darker rare earth, the Chinese have made their deals in the Latin American triangle. Sure, Afghan rare earth materials would be nice, but they don't need them. And the final thing I'll say on that is that the amount of investment that is needed to reach a lot of the Afghan resources in terms of infrastructure is very significant. So in my mind, what's going to drive economic investment into Afghanistan is not going to be that this is just such a rich resource-rich country with great opportunity. It's going to be the fact that you need a minimum degree of stability on your borders. Yeah, so I think what's got to be realistic about what is attractive and what is not attractive, and what's also got to be realistic about what the international community can and cannot do.
Okay, and Mr. Davis, I would like to ask you that, how can school education help to mitigate the current crisis in Afghanistan? I mean, women make up almost 50% of the population, and not allowing girls to go to school, or not allowing women to go back to work. How will that impact the country socially, economically, and also how will it impact the region?
It's a good indicator of the problems of sort of trying to talk about Afghanistan to a certain extent, because we talk about the Taliban and we talk about Afghanistan. What's particularly interesting is that it's not a homogenous movement, and Afghanistan's not a homogenous country. We, for example, we know that actually some girls are going to secondary school in some of the provinces, and this has always been the case. It has been a sort of patchy approach to women and girls across the country. But ultimately, I mean, it's a truism that, if 50% of the population is denied access and equality, then the country will be held back. The particular improvements that the country has made over the last 2 decades have been for women and girls. Nearly 40% of the school population now is girls. It's still got a way to go to get to equality. The improvements in maternal health have been staggering, admittedly from low levels. The fertility rate looks more like sub-Saharan Africa than it does sort of Central Asian, but it is coming down. Without that, the country will not make the progress that, say, we've seen in Bangladesh, and it's a similar problem for Pakistan to address as well. So, if the Taliban leadership think that they will achieve the sort of emirate which they're after without including women, then they're mistaken. But equally, at the local level, there seems to be a level of de facto federalism, which also seems to be a way for the Taliban to manage cohesion within the movement. So we may see that women have access to education. There was a fatwa, I think, on Wednesday, actually at the central level, which allowed female aid workers access and ended access as long as they were following Shia regulations in terms of mahram and the hijab. So it's a difficult picture to understand, just as it is across the board, and it'd be interesting to see how it unfolds. But one of the most remarkable things that I've seen, and I didn't expect this to happen, was women standing up for their rights across Afghanistan, despite the fear, despite the reprisals. And I think that's something the international community really does need to recognize, and has recognized in its initial dealings. That the international community has been very clear. The Taliban need an inclusive government, and they need to respect human rights. And those things are prerequisites for any legitimacy. But as others have said in this discussion, we've seen no movement at all in those areas yet.
We just have the last 5 minutes, so I'd like concluding remarks from all of you. How things can change. And Fahad, would you like to add? Would you like to answer some of the questions that were raised by Mr. Dorsey? And also, just give your concluding remarks, and then I'll go to all the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehmal. I think some very excellent points have been made, and if I were to sort of try and stitch them together in terms of how I'm looking at it, I think from our point of view, from Pakistan's point of view, or that's the vantage point that I also have. We have entered into a very turbulent period where both our policies as well as the situation on the ground are not giving the kind of dividends that I think we wanted, expected, or desired. So there is a bit of a confusion in terms of how do we move ahead from here. There are essentially 3 tracks that the government is following right now. If I could quickly just touch upon them. Number 1 is how to step up diplomatic effort, specifically in the region, and also directed mainly at the US. So the key focus for these diplomatic efforts is greater regional cooperation, coordination, and integration of activities in terms of leveraging the diplomatic heft, so to speak, of the regional countries to try and get something done in Afghanistan. And the other is like a laser focus, how to get Washington on board and not make things worse than they already are. So that's happening on the diplomatic front. On the second, on the ground, I think there were, as Taimur Saab said, that there were some inadvisable moves, like the Prime Minister saying that I'm going to mediate between issues between Afghanistan and other countries, which have now been sort of scaled back a bit. So there were also, for example, the foreign minister was at one point quoted as saying that Pakistan was going to send some specialists in Afghanistan to try and help them manage their governance, which of course was the stuff of memes, because Pakistan at this particular point trying to teach governance to another country is rather rich. But those have also been thankfully scaled back a bit. So I think on the ground right now, essentially Pakistan is trying to manage the borders to ensure that they remain sealed and instability does not spill over. And the third track, which is very important, is something that was referred to earlier, is this latest attempt by Pakistan to try and stitch up a deal with the TTP. And that's something which has been happening for a couple of months, if not perhaps a year. And the latest reports, which are fairly confirmed, published in the newspaper I work for. So obviously, since if I can plug in my newspaper also, it's being the most credible paper, one has to accept that the news was right. That deal is now in the early stages. We don't know which way it will go. It will definitely generate a lot of debate, but it is part of the larger strategic outreach that Pakistan is trying to engage in wake of the Taliban takeover of Kabul. So these 3 strands are defining which way Pakistan goes. The result, the outcome of all 3 is still up in the air, and I think the next couple of weeks are crucial in terms of determining whether we are getting something out of it.
Thank you, Fahad. Dr. Taimur, if you could add something to it. concluding remarks, and then I'd go to the other two panelists.
Sure. I think Fahad has done a great job in summarizing how the government is thinking. I'll try to, do a reasonable job, at least, in summarizing how, people who are in civil society are thinking. And our view, perhaps, is that the entire policy of thinking that utilizing religious fundamentalist groups in the context of Kashmir, in the context of Afghanistan, and even within campuses in Pakistan that began in the 1980s has to be entirely rethought, because we've seen the fruits of this entire development over the last 40 years or so now, and we see that this is going nowhere. In fact, it's going to wreck society. So I am one of those people who has always argued that all the deals that we've ever made with the TTP, when they were the 6 pacts that we made with them when they were fighting a civil war here in Pakistan, the deals we made with TLP, the deals we made with all the other organizations have all been to the detriment of Pakistan and have actually helped to showcase and push extremism forward. I think a more determined, and whenever Pakistan has stood up and said, these are our laws, these are our constitutional guarantees, and we will defend them with whatever force we have at our disposal, is when things have gotten better. So I think Pakistan's state and society have to be very aware that cross-border terrorism from Afghanistan into Pakistan is going to become a growing and very serious concern. And on that, a clear line in the sand has to be drawn, and we have to make sure that extremism doesn't come back into Pakistan the way we faced it in the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry, we've run out of time. I would have come to you, Edward and Mr. Dorsey. But thank you very much. This was a very enlightening discussion, and I'm sure our audiences must have loved the discussion as well. And thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your valuable time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mehmal.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.